Good evening, my name is Brian Gerrish. I used to be a naval officer. I left the Navy in 1993 and set up a small business in Plymouth. And at that stage my life was quite organised and comfortable, and I was doing all the things which people normally do: go to work, have a family life and enjoy the world as it is. But as time went on, I began to notice some things which I thought were rather strange, and I started to realise that in the papers I was reading material which I thought was unusual. I started to see that there was a lot of articles written about the European Union, and overwhelmingly these were very positive, while I saw very little material about the European Union that was negative. And if I did, then usually the articles were tucked away in the paper, they weren't on the front page. But if I go back to about 1994-95, I didn't really know a lot about the European Union. I was only really starting to pay attention to something that seemed to be a little bit more than a group of nations getting together. In the paper I also began to read other articles about people getting involved in a way that I wasn't used to. I began to see articles about the clergy who were helping to put together meetings to promote regional assemblies, and in particular the Bishop of the South West was chairing a meeting to promote the South West Regional Assembly, and I thought this was rather odd that we had senior members of the church becoming active in politics when for years they decided that rather the church should steer clear of mainstream politics. I also began to see things that were talking about crime, and you read some articles and you couldn't help but get the feeling that things were somewhat on their head, that we were seeing the victim victimised whilst the perpetrator of the crime seemed to be getting off lightly or even leaving the courtroom smiling. And certainly to an observer like myself, you would feel that the justice for which Great Britain was known had changed. School children were not to be left out of the loop, because now school children were being taught all manner of things with political correctness. It had become a crime for children to play conkers, or a health and safety issue. And we were also seeing children being pulled into a world of political correctness in what they did. And I was curious as to where this change in direction had come from, but there were certainly no answers in the paper. As time went on and I began to get more interested and I began to ask questions, I started to meet other people who would talk to me about what they knew was going on. And those people, particularly the ones who were well read, started to talk of basically a plan to undermine British society. And that plan was to attack all of the main institutions and pillars of our society. So those who previously we'd looked to with respect as pillars of society were then starting to come under ridicule, whether it happened to MPs or senior members of the police or senior members of the civil service. But you started to get an uneasy feeling that things which had stood us in good stead for a long time were starting to be gently pulled apart. I became more curious, and over a period of time I started to get very interested in what was the seat of power, how were these changes being made. Now, one of the things that was easy to see is that if you picked up publications, you could often see that they had a heavy political agenda, and that might be literature that was meant for school children, where you would find documents supposedly talking about history, but clearly talking about the benefits of the European Union. Sex education had become very broad, and in general very young children, increasingly young children, were being encouraged to know and learn and perhaps experiment in sexual practices that many of us would regard as not desirable. So somewhere there had to be people who were actually putting together the literature and deciding that our society was to go in a new direction. But who were those people? That was the thing that I had to learn. It started to come out slowly, but with more and more research, a picture began to emerge and certain names began to crop up. I began to become aware of the Fabians. Now, some people have heard of the Fabians. Many people regard them as a harmless socialist club where people get together to discuss the socialist view on life. But if you take a look at the Fabian logo of a wolf in sheep's clothing, you begin to realise that perhaps there's something more sinister at work in the Fabian society, particularly when you see another logo that they particularly like using, which is two men hammering the world into a new shape. Perhaps they're hammering our society into a new shape. So behind the scenes, whilst most people look at society and think it rumbles on in a normal way, with normal politics, with two main parties, and perhaps one side party, the Lib Dems, and a few other so-called extremist parties, as they're labelled in the mainstream press, people believe that their world is governed in a very organised way. When you dig deeper and you start to take the lid off it, you begin to realise that it isn't the mainstream parties which are driving our society, but individuals within those parties and the people who pull their strings outside them. I stumbled across an organisation called Common Purpose, and I was intrigued to find that in my city a charity was working amongst every sector of society. It was there in the hospitals, the police, it was there in the schools, it was in the local council, the police, the military, and I'd never heard of it. Now, some of you will know that I've produced a variety of information, and we have a new CD, or DVD rather, which is talking about Common Purpose, and that is a 1 hour 55 minute presentation. But tonight I just really want to touch on the main things as to why this organisation is so interesting. Common Purpose is a charity which talks about change. It's interested in changing our lives. And what it is saying is that the old society that we knew, which was stable, we had a justice system, or it might not have been perfect, but it worked. We had an education system that produced people with sufficient knowledge and wisdom to go on and succeed in their lives, that many of those areas needed to be changed. And Common Purpose, although a charity, was going to set out in our society to change our lives. How does it do it? Well, Common Purpose is very clever because basically it encourages people to step into areas which seem quite reasonable. It says that if you're in a job as perhaps a county councillor or a policeman or a nurse, it might be particularly good for you to mix with other people and hear what they do in their job. And so Common Purpose will bring people together to break people out of their silos, to learn about other people. I'm going to keep going even though the clock has chimed. The trick is that when you bring people together and they learn about each other's particular professions, it's very interesting, and you can imagine on a nice day in a nice warm comfortable room with good food and good company, you can feel that you're achieving a lot. When you've finished, however, some questions need to be asked. Do you, as a policeman, need to know the information you've learnt about a hospital or about how life works in your local authority? Do you need to know? Do you actually intend to use that information, and if you do, is it for your benefit or is it for the benefit of your organisation or the police force? What common purpose actually starts to do is to grey the boundaries between one particular profession and another. And if you take it a step further and you bring common purpose graduates in one place and they start to work at a level outside the boundaries and probity of their home organisation, then what you're actually doing is beginning to break down the whole structure of society. Imagine, for example, a policeman who is common purpose trained, sitting in a room with both the local council and members of companies who want money to further projects. And those meetings discuss subjects to do with the award of money, but the meetings are held under Chatham House rules. The Chatham House rule says that at any meeting you can divulge information, but you cannot say who said it, and you cannot admit the meeting at which it was said. So effectively, we would now have a police officer and council officers who should have a bound of probity to their profession and the public, giving away information in secret. If everybody was honest, we wouldn't have a problem. However, we know that people aren't all honest, and so what common purpose starts to do is to actually allow people to gain information and to pass it amongst their common purpose colleagues in a way which mimics the Freemasons. In this case, we know that common purpose is highly political in its intent because it is backed strongly by European banks, including the Deutsche Bank, and we know from common purpose's own material that it is highly pro-European Union. So we start to get an uneasy picture of an organisation working under the surface of society, bringing people together, educating them in a political way, and educating them about the benefits of the European Union. Common purpose is also very keen to talk to school children, and exactly the same thing applies. Common purpose will run courses in schools where it will talk about the wonders of the European Union, but at the same time it forgets about teaching children the values and the history of their own country. What this starts to do over a period of time is confuse people. They're no longer entirely comfortable with their own nationality, and they are being pushed towards a rather combined nationality, part of the supranational state with the European Union. Common purpose also attacks values. Common purpose says that diversity is to be celebrated and that we should have equal numbers of people on every board, on every committee, around every table of every organisation. Now, whilst this may appear to be reasonable on a casual glance, when you start to think about it, it is unfair, because there will be occasions when there will be a predominance of one type of person, and they may be there due to the fact that they work to be in that position. It's not a question of what colour they are, it's a question of what they have done to achieve the position in which they are. Common purpose doesn't want to follow these rules. It wants to set politically correct rules for who will be given positions of power. Common purpose is also very keen on saying that it is creating future leaders. And these are leaders who are going to lead in every sector of society. They are going to lead in politics, they are going to lead in civil society, they are going to lead in schools, education, the police, etc. The thing about these leaders is that they're not elected democratically. They are simply chosen by other common purpose people. And so what you are starting to create at one go is a little private elitist club. And indeed on other papers on the internet, if you do your research, you will find other people describing common purpose as an elitist organisation. If I draw you back to what's happening in society, many people are now saying that something is badly wrong in UK. They are saying things don't work anymore, whether it's the trains or the hospitals or the schools or what service you expect from your local council. There's an air that what we used to have that was good and well organised is becoming disorganised and fragmented. If we start to join up the pieces, what I believe from the research that I've done and from the research which is coming in from hundreds of people across UK, is that a number of organisations are actually pulling the UK apart. They are doing it with political correctness. That is not a joke, it's a form of cultural Marxism. It is designed to control how people think. We are starting to see organisations making strange decisions, and if we do our homework, we find that many of those organisations contain common purpose leaders. Could it be that those leaders are actually helping to break down society before we form the new so-called EU utopian state? All in all, UK is in a bad state at the moment, and many people are starting to point a finger to our politicians to say the problem rests with you. At the moment, we watch debates in Westminster on major issues such as immigration, where there are 13 members in the House. Where are our MPs? Where is the debate? Where is the open debate in front of the public? Why won't our MPs answer letters from the public asking them to take action? More and more people are describing that there appears to be a wall of silence from our politicians, and even the politicians that dare to speak out are hounded into silence. Some of them admit to being threatened. So we don't have a pretty picture. What do we need for all this to happen? We need one thing, we need money. And if we start to look at the monetary institutions in both the United Kingdom and in America and worldwide, we start to see some rather interesting things. We see increasingly vast financial empires charging millions upon millions of people outlandish interest on money which they have created. Money which is simply noughts created in computer systems for which you are then charged real interest and for which you have to work in order to repay. In UK we have the system where the government has deliberately engineered loans for students so that young people who should start their working life happy and free and now qualified from their studies at university are actually entering their working lives in debt. And to make matters worse, the government has sold that debt onto foreign banks. Why have they done this? The answer must be to keep those young people in a bondage of debt for the rest of their life. Why would you want to do this? Well, I think that when you put the picture together with the fact that we see our society being broken down, and we see an organisation called Common Purpose working closely with the Fabian Society and Demos and the Council for Foreign Relations and the European Union and the Royal Institute of International Affairs and the Tavistock Institute, we are starting to see a major attack on our country. What can we do? That's the question that more and more people are asking. What can we do to stop this? I think the answer is very simple. We need to start talking, and we need to start talking about the truth. We know our country is under attack. We know it's being pulled apart from within. We know that the attack is funded by banks, and we have now got to start telling people what we know. We need to name names, we need to name organisations, and above all, we need to demand of our MPs that they start to dismantle the attack upon the United Kingdom. Is it an attack? Yes. Is it real? Yes. Are people being hurt? Yes. Is it treason? Yes. We have the evidence that treasonous decisions and treasonous plots have been carried out and are being carried out in UK. Now that we know what's happening, we must speak out. And I urge you to research the internet to find as much information as possible on common purpose and treason in UK. So to just finish the talk this evening, I'd just like to remind you that if you want to find information, you can get hold of a copy of this DVD, from www.ukcolumn.org, and from the same site you're able to get hold of a copy of our newspaper, the UK Column, which is really telling the truth about what is happening in UK. And unlike the mainstream newspapers, which are definitely not telling the truth, you can read the truth with the UK Column. So please visit the site www.ukcolumn.org, and we will be pleased to log you on as a new reader and have you read about what's happening in UK. Thank you very much.